Something unprecedented just happened in Washington. House Democratic leadership walked up to a podium yesterday and delivered what they're calling an ultimatum to President Trump. According to their public statements, the choice is simple. Fire Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem immediately, or they'll move forward with impeachment proceedings. This is House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, along with the Democratic Whip Catherine Clark and Caucus Chair Pete Aguilar, speaking with one unified voice. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," Jeffries said at yesterday's press conference. According to the Democrats' own count, over 160 House members have now signed on to an impeachment resolution targeting Kristi Noem. That number, they say, keeps growing. And whether this threat has teeth or whether it's political theater, one thing is clear. Donald Trump is facing serious pressure from congressional Democrats over how his administration has handled immigration enforcement in Minneapolis. This is the story of a rapidly evolving political crisis. How 2 deaths during federal immigration operations in Minneapolis have created a constitutional and political flashpoint. How Kristi Noem has gone from a prominent Trump cabinet member to the target of impeachment calls. And how Trump now faces strategic choices that could shape the rest of his presidency and potentially impact the midterm election. Let's examine what's happening, what the key players are saying, and what might come next. Because whether you agree with Democrats or Republicans on this issue, the constitutional questions being raised matter for everyone. According to public reports and Democratic leadership statements, the ultimatum came yesterday afternoon during a press conference. Hakeem Jeffries, standing alongside his leadership team, delivered a message they directed at President Trump. The message, according to their prepared remarks, "The violence unleashed on the American people by the Department of Homeland Security must end forthwith. Kristi Noem should be fired immediately, or we will commence impeachment proceedings in the House of Representatives." Democrats characterize this as more than political posturing. Representative Robin Kelly of Illinois initially introduced the impeachment resolution on January 14th, according to congressional records. But support has reportedly grown substantially following recent events in Minneapolis. Representative Jamie Raskin, the ranking Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee, announced that even if Republican Chairman Jim Jordan declines to pursue impeachment, Democrats plan to use the Oversight and Homeland Security Committees to investigate what they're calling potential constitutional violations by Secretary Noem. Raskin stated publicly that Democrats will examine every potential constitutional crime and every episode of bureaucratic lawlessness. Whether or not these characterizations are accurate, the political dynamic is clear. Democrats are applying maximum pressure, and they're not waiting for Republican cooperation. To understand why Democrats are pushing this strategy, we need to examine what happened in Minneapolis over the past 3 weeks. The facts, as reported by various sources, paint a complex and disputed picture. On January 7th, according to multiple news reports, a 31-year-old nursing assistant named Renee Good was shot and killed during an ICE operation in Minneapolis. Initial statements from the Department of Homeland Security, as reported in the press, characterized the incident as involving interference with federal law enforcement. According to some witness accounts reported in local media, Good's proximity to the operation may have been coincidental rather than intentional interference. The circumstances remain disputed. Secretary Noem's public statements, as documented in media interviews, defended the officers involved. According to her statements at the time, Good had interfered with the operation in a manner that created risk for federal agents. Critics argue this characterization wasn't supported by available evidence. The administration maintains its version of events. The second incident occurred on January 24th. According to witness accounts and media reports, a 37-year-old ICU nurse and military veteran named Alex Pretty was shot and killed by Border Patrol agents in Minneapolis. Pretty had been participating in protests against immigration enforcement operations, according to multiple sources, and was legally carrying a firearm with a valid permit. Minnesota law allows open carry. What happened next is where accounts diverge significantly. According to statements posted on social media by Stephen Miller, Trump's deputy chief of staff, Pretty was an assassin who attempted to murder federal agents. Vice President J.D. Vance shared this characterization. Secretary Noem gave media interviews in which she stated, according to transcripts, that Pretty had brandished a weapon and violently resisted officers. However, according to witness accounts reported by multiple news organizations, the situation unfolded differently. These witnesses claim Pretty was complying with officer commands when he was shot. Some reports reference body cam footage that purportedly shows Pretty with his hands raised. Department of Homeland Security's own reporting, according to documents referenced by Congressional Democrats, allegedly contains details that contradict some of the initial characterizations. The administration disputes this version of events. A spokesperson for Secretary Noem stated yesterday that Pretty committed a federal crime while armed as he obstructed an active law enforcement operation. So we have two very different narratives. Democrats and critics argue that federal officials made false statements and refused to correct them when confronted with evidence. The administration argues that their characterization was accurate and that criticism is politically motivated. This disagreement over the facts is precisely why Democrats say impeachment may be warranted. In their view, making false statements about circumstances involving the death of American citizens rises to the level of impeachable conduct. Whether that argument will persuade anyone beyond committed Democrats remains to be seen. Washington has certainly seen impeachment threats before. Cabinet officials have been threatened with impeachment during both Republican and Democratic administrations. Usually these threats don't materialize into actual proceedings. They serve as political pressure tactics rather than serious constitutional mechanisms. But Democrats argue this situation is different for several reasons. First, according to their own count, support within their caucus is substantial and growing. 163 House Democrats reportedly support the resolution. That represents, by their math, roughly 3/4 of the Democratic caucus. Whether this number is accurate and whether it will continue to grow depends on developments over the coming days. Second, there appears to be some Republican criticism of Noem's handling of the situation, though characterizing it as defections may overstate the case. Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina, when asked by reporters whether he had confidence in Noem, reportedly said, "No, not at all." Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska has reportedly expressed concerns about leadership at DHS. Senator Rand Paul, who chairs the Senate Homeland Security Committee, has called for administrative leave for the officers involved and is demanding investigations. These aren't endorsements of impeachment necessarily, but they do suggest that some Republicans have questions about how the administration handled Minneapolis. Whether this translates into actual cooperation with Democrats on accountability measures is uncertain. Third, there appears to be public reaction beyond typical partisan lines. A GoFundMe campaign for Alex Pretty's family has reportedly raised over $1.5 million, according to the platform. Protests continue in Minneapolis, according to local media coverage. Some gun rights advocates have reportedly criticized the administration's response, particularly Trump's comment that Pritti shouldn't have been carrying a gun, despite having a legal permit. And fourth, Trump's own response has been notably measured. When asked by reporters yesterday whether Noem would keep her job, Trump reportedly said, "She's doing a very good job." This is hardly a full-throated defense. Trump didn't attack Noem's critics. He didn't frame this as a partisan witch hunt. He didn't make it a loyalty test. Some observers interpret this as Trump keeping his options open. Others see it as appropriate caution, given an ongoing investigation. The interpretation depends largely on your political perspective. According to multiple reports, Noem met with Trump at the White House earlier this week. The content of that conversation hasn't been made public, but one can imagine the president might have expressed concerns about the political fallout and asked for better crisis management. The political challenge Trump faces is real, regardless of the underlying facts. He traveled to Iowa yesterday to deliver an economic speech, according to news coverage. The White House clearly wanted to pivot away from Minneapolis and toward accomplishments like tax cuts and economic growth. But according to reporters who covered the Iowa event, questions about Alex Pritti dominated even that carefully staged appearance. This is the dilemma Trump's team is grappling with. How do you change the subject when the subject keeps following you? So, what are Trump's realistic options? Let's examine them objectively. Option 1. Fire Kristi Noem. This would satisfy the Democrats' stated demand. It would allow Trump to claim he's taking accountability seriously. He could nominate a new Homeland Security Secretary and potentially reset the narrative. The downsides are significant. It could look like capitulation to political pressure, which might anger Trump's base. Some conservative voices would likely criticize it as weakness. And critically, firing Noem wouldn't end the controversy. Democrats would still push for investigations. They would still demand accountability for the officers involved. They would still use Minneapolis as a campaign issue. Plus, any new nominee would face confirmation hearings focused entirely on Minneapolis and what reforms they'd implement. Option 2. Keep Noem and let Democrats proceed with impeachment. This is the defiant approach. Trump could characterize this as partisan politics. He could rally his base around the idea that Democrats are attacking border security. He could force Democrats to actually follow through on their threat. The downsides here are also substantial. Democrats appear prepared to actually pursue this, based on their public statements. Representative Raskin has outlined specific investigative plans. And unlike some previous impeachment threats, this one has at least some Republicans expressing concerns, which makes it harder to frame as purely partisan. The longer this drags on, the more it dominates news coverage and distracts from other priorities. Option 3. Seek a middle ground. Trump could push Noem to issue a more comprehensive statement. He could announce reforms at DHS. He could replace some senior officials while keeping Noem. He could order an independent investigation. This would be an attempt to address concerns without fully capitulating. The problem with this approach is that it risks satisfying no one. Democrats have already stated that firing Noem is their minimum demand. Anything less than that, they say, will result in impeachment proceedings. Meanwhile, any reforms or apologies might alienate Trump's base, who generally support aggressive immigration enforcement. These are genuinely difficult strategic choices without obvious correct answers. Adding to Trump's pressure, Senate Democrats have reportedly indicated they'll block government funding legislation that includes Homeland Security appropriations. According to some reports, a potential partial shutdown could occur this Friday if the funding dispute isn't resolved. Whether Democrats will actually follow through on this threat and whether it would politically benefit them remains uncertain. Meanwhile, Trump is clearly attempting to redirect focus. His Iowa speech yesterday was explicitly about the economy, according to transcripts. He talked about tax cuts, stock market gains, and economic growth. He's trying to make the 2026 midterms about prosperity rather than controversy. Whether this strategy succeeds depends on multiple factors outside Trump's control. It depends on whether the Minneapolis situation stabilizes or escalates. It depends on whether additional incidents occur during immigration enforcement operations. It depends on whether congressional investigations produce damaging revelations or vindicate the administration's version of events. Republican strategists speaking to reporters have suggested that the bigger problem isn't even the incidents themselves, but rather how the administration responded. One strategist told the press that the response to the shooting has become the dominant story. This person argued that if the administration had expressed more caution initially, promised thorough investigation, and avoided definitive characterizations before facts were clear, the political damage might have been more contained. Whether that analysis is correct is debatable, but it highlights a political reality. In crisis management, how you respond often matters more than what actually happened. So where does this leave us? Democrats have issued what they're calling an ultimatum. Over 160 members have reportedly signed an impeachment resolution. Some Republicans have expressed concerns, though not necessarily support for impeachment. Trump is trying to pivot to economic messaging, but keeps getting pulled back to Minneapolis. And Kristi Noem remains in her position while this political storm swirls. The next several days will likely be critical. Will Trump make any changes at DHS? Will Democrats actually begin formal impeachment proceedings? Will more Republicans break ranks? Will the government funding dispute escalate into a shutdown? Will new information emerge about what happened in Minneapolis? These questions don't have clear answers yet. What we can say is that this controversy has already significantly complicated Trump's second-term agenda. Every day spent managing this crisis is a day not spent on other priorities. Every Republican forced to defend or distance themselves from the administration's Minneapolis response is a political cost. Every protest and news story keeps the issue alive. For Democrats, the political calculus is different. They're betting that keeping pressure on Noem and Trump will either force meaningful accountability or demonstrate Republican unwillingness to hold their own officials responsible. They're hoping this becomes a defining issue for the midterms. They're using every procedural tool available to maximize pressure. Whether this benefits Democrats electorally is far from certain. Impeachment threats can backfire if they're seen as overreach. Voters might prioritize economic issues over controversies. The midterms are still 9 months away, which is an eternity in politics. What we're watching is a high-stakes political confrontation with constitutional implications. Questions about executive power, congressional oversight, law enforcement accountability, and constitutional rights are all in play. Whatever your political perspective, these are serious questions that deserve serious examination. The ultimatum has been delivered. The pressure is mounting. The choices are difficult. And the consequences of whatever Trump decides will likely reverberate through the remainder of his term and potentially shape the balance of power in Congress. We'll be watching closely to see what happens next. Because this isn't just about political tactics or partisan advantage. It's about fundamental questions of accountability, truthfulness, and constitutional governance. Those questions matter regardless of which party you support. The easy way or the hard way, that's how Democrats have framed Trump's choice. Whether he agrees with that framing or rejects it entirely, he still has to make a decision. And that decision will tell us a great deal about how the rest of this presidency will unfold.